December 1944. While most of the world was still at war, while cities were burning, economies collapsing, and millions of soldiers were dying across Europe and the Pacific, a very different kind of battle was already being fought in a quiet mountain resort in New Hampshire. There were no tanks, no bombs, no gunfire, just papers, calculations, closed-door meetings, and men who understood something most people didn't yet realize. Whoever controlled money after the war would control the world long after the shooting stopped. This is the story of how the modern financial system was designed before the war even ended, how a single currency was positioned to dominate the planet, and how decisions made by a small group of officials reshaped global power for the next 80 years. But to understand how Bretton Woods happened, you first need to understand the fear that made it necessary. Before World War II, the global financial system was already broken. Completely, the world was still haunted by the aftermath of World War I, a conflict that shattered empires, currencies, and trust between nations. Europe was drowning in debt, Germany was crushed by reparations, Britain was exhausted, France was unstable, and the international monetary system that had once provided order, the gold standard, was collapsing under its own weight. Countries had tied their currencies to gold, believing it would guarantee stability. In reality, it did the opposite. When economies slowed, governments couldn't print money to respond. Deflation spiraled. Banks failed. Unemployment exploded. And as the Great Depression spread across continents, nations stopped cooperating and started protecting themselves. By the early 1930s, countries were devaluing their currencies, imposing trade barriers, and hoarding gold. Every nation was trying to save itself, even if it meant destroying global trade in the process. This wasn't just an economic crisis. It was a systemic failure. International finance had turned into a zero-sum game, and the consequences were catastrophic. Economic collapse fueled political extremism. It empowered authoritarian regimes, it destabilized democracies, and it created the conditions that made another world war not just possible, but inevitable. The United States watched all of this closely, and unlike Europe, the U.S. emerged from the chaos in a radically different position. While European nations bled gold, the U.S. accumulated it. While factories in Europe were destroyed, American industry expanded. By the time World War II was underway, the United States was no longer just a participant in the global economy. It was becoming its anchor. American factories supplied the war. American banks financed production. American farms fed armies. And most importantly, American vaults filled with gold as desperate nations paid for survival. By 1944, the numbers were staggering. The United States held roughly two-thirds of the world's gold reserves. No empire in history had ever controlled that much monetary power. And American policymakers understood something critical. Once the war ended, the world would need rebuilding on a scale never seen before. Europe would need capital. Trade would need to restart. Currencies would need stability. And whoever provided that framework would sit at the center of the new world order. But there was a problem. If the world simply returned to the old gold standard, the same failures would repeat. Fixed currencies, rigid systems, and competitive devaluations had already proven disastrous. Another Great Depression wasn't just possible, it was likely, and American leaders knew that economic collapse after the war could undo the military victory itself. Winning the war wouldn't matter if the peace collapsed into chaos. So the question wasn't whether a new financial system was needed. The question was who would design it. As early as 1942, while battles still raged, American and British economists began quietly drafting blueprints for a post-war monetary order. Two men emerged as the intellectual architects of the future. John Maynard Keynes, representing Britain, and Harry Dexter White, representing the United States. Both understood the stakes. Both knew that finance was power, but they had very different visions of what the new world should look like. Keynes wanted a system that constrained surplus countries as much as debtor nations. He feared a world dominated by a single creditor. He proposed a neutral international currency, independent of any nation, to prevent one country from gaining overwhelming influence. White, on the other hand, saw reality clearly. The United States had the gold, the production, and the leverage. Why build a neutral system when America could anchor it? Why surrender power when history had handed it to you? This tension between cooperation and dominance would define everything that followed. In July 1944, representatives from 44 allied nations were invited to the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Officially, the conference was about stability, recovery, and cooperation. Unofficially, it was about control. Most of the delegations arrived exhausted, dependent, and financially weak. The United States arrived as the world's banker, and the imbalance in power was impossible to ignore. The setting was deceptively calm. Grand hallways, mountain air, formal dinners. But beneath the surface, the decisions being negotiated would determine how money flowed across borders, who could borrow, who could print, and who would pay the price when crises inevitably returned. Many delegates didn't fully grasp what was being locked into place. They were focused on immediate survival, reconstruction loans, aid, stability. Few realized that the structure being designed would quietly centralize global finance around a single currency: the dollar. The proposal was elegant, and that's why it worked. Instead of every currency being tied directly to gold, they would be tied to the US dollar, and the dollar alone would be convertible to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. On paper, this looked like compromise. In practice, it placed the United States at the center of the system. Every major currency now depended on the dollar's stability. Every international transaction passed through it. Gold didn't disappear, it was simply moved behind American walls. Alongside this new monetary order came institutions that still exist today. The International Monetary Fund would provide short-term financial assistance to countries in crisis, enforcing discipline and stability. The World Bank would finance reconstruction and development. Both were headquartered in Washington. Both operated under rules heavily influenced by American priorities, and both reinforced the same structure. Access to global finance now flowed through institutions designed, funded, and dominated by the United States. By the time the conference ended, the framework of modern global finance was complete. The war wasn't over yet, but the peace had already been designed, and most of the world accepted it not because it was perfect, but because there was no alternative. Europe needed dollars. Asia needed rebuilding, and America had what everyone else lacked: capital, credibility, and leverage. But here's the part almost no one talks about. Bretton Woods didn't just create stability. It created dependence, and it quietly transformed the dollar from a national currency into a global instrument of power. A system that looked cooperative on the surface embedded asymmetry at its core. The United States could run deficits that others couldn't. It could export dollars instead of gold. It could finance its influence without immediate consequence. And for decades, this system worked not because it was fair, but because it was backed by unmatched economic and military strength. This is where the story truly begins. Because Bretton Woods was not the end of the transformation, it was the foundation. What came next would turn the dollar into something no currency had ever been before. Not just a medium of exchange, but the backbone of global trade, debt, and power. And in the next part of this story, we'll see how post-war reconstruction, American aid, and strategic generosity locked entire continents into a dollar-based world willingly, enthusiastically, and without fully understanding the price. The war created the opportunity. Bretton Woods created the rules. What followed would change everything. When World War II finally ended in 1945, victory did not bring relief. It brought exhaustion. Europe was physically shattered, economically paralyzed, and financially empty. Cities were piles of rubble. Railways were destroyed. Factories stood silent. Food was scarce. Inflation surged. Governments faced a terrifying reality. Without immediate economic recovery, political collapse would follow. And history had already shown what desperation could produce. The war had been won on the battlefield, but the peace was fragile, and everyone knew it. The United States looked at this devastation from a position no country had ever occupied before. Its industrial base was intact. Its workforce was mobilized. Its financial system was stable. And most importantly, it controlled the currency that now sat at the center of the global system. Dollars weren't just money anymore. They were the fuel required to restart the world. This is where the Marshall Plan enters the story. often remembered as an act of generosity, but better understood as a strategic In 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall announced a massive aid program to rebuild Europe. Officially called the European Recovery Program, it promised billions of dollars in assistance to war-torn nations. Over 4 years, the United States sent more than $13 billion overseas, an astronomical sum at the time. The stated goal was simple: rebuild infrastructure, restore production, and stabilize economies. And on the surface, it worked. Factories reopened, trade resumed, living standards improved. Europe recovered faster than anyone had expected. But the Marshall Plan was never just about rebuilding. It was about integration. Every dollar sent abroad strengthened the dollar's role as the medium of exchange. Aid wasn't delivered in gold. It wasn't delivered in neutral currency. It was delivered in dollars, spent through American-approved channels, often on American goods. European economies didn't just recover. They reconnected themselves to a dollar-based system of trade, finance, and dependence. This mattered because post-war Europe didn't just lack capital. It lacked trust. Domestic currencies were weak. Savings had been wiped out. Inflation had destroyed confidence in money itself. The dollar filled that vacuum. It became the unit of account for trade, the reserve held by central banks, and the benchmark for stability. Bretton Woods had created the rules. The Marshall Plan enforced them through necessity. At the same time, American policymakers were deeply aware of another threat: communism. Economic collapse created fertile ground for radical ideologies. The memory of the 1930s was fresh. If Europe failed economically, political extremism could return. The Soviet Union understood this too. That's why the Marshall Plan wasn't just economic aid. It was a geopolitical weapon. Countries that accepted it aligned themselves with the American-led system. Countries that rejected it fell behind the Iron Curtain. This division hardened quickly. Western Europe rebuilt under a dollar-centered framework. Eastern Europe was sealed off into a different economic universe. The global financial system was no longer just about efficiency or stability. It was about alignment. By the early 1950s, the effects were unmistakable. The dollar dominated international trade. Commodities were priced in dollars. Contracts were written in dollars. Central banks held dollars as reserves. And because the dollar was pegged to gold, confidence remained high. For most countries, holding dollars was as good as holding gold itself. The system appeared stable, predictable, and fair. But beneath that stability was a structural imbalance that few fully appreciated at the time. Under Bretton Woods, other countries had to manage their economies carefully to maintain their exchange rates. If they ran persistent deficits, they risked losing dollar reserves. The United States, however, played by different rules. As the issuer of the world's reserve currency, it could run deficits without immediate penalty. It could spend abroad, invest, and maintain military bases across the globe, all while exporting dollars instead of gold. What other nations had to earn through trade, the U.S. could create through policy. This asymmetry wasn't a bug. It was the core feature of the system. As global trade expanded, so did the demand for dollars. And as demand grew, the United States faced a paradox that would later become famous among economists. To supply the world with dollars, the U.S. had to run deficits. But the more dollars it created, the harder it became to maintain the promise that each one could be converted into gold. For years, this tension remained hidden, masked by growth, confidence, and American dominance. During the 1950s and early 1960s, the system functioned remarkably well. Europe rebuilt, Japan industrialized. Global trade exploded. The dollar was trusted. Institutions like the IMF and World Bank became permanent fixtures of the international landscape. On the surface, it looked like Bretton Woods had solved the chaos of the interwar period. But stability has a cost, and that cost was flexibility. As economies grew more complex, fixed exchange rates became harder to maintain. Capital moved faster. Trade volumes increased. Governments faced domestic pressures that didn't always align with international commitments. Meanwhile, the United States began spending more aggressively, both at home and abroad. Social programs expanded. Military commitments deepened. The Vietnam War escalated. Dollars flowed out of the country at an accelerating pace. Foreign governments started to notice. Central banks accumulated massive dollar reserves and quietly asked the uncomfortable question, were there really enough gold reserves to back all these dollars? Technically, they had the right to demand conversion. Politically, doing so risked destabilizing the system they depended on. This is where trust replaced enforcement. For a time, no one wanted to test the system too aggressively. The dollar was still the best option available. Alternatives were weak. Gold was impractical for modern trade, and no other country could offer a credible replacement, so the imbalance grew. Tolerated because the system worked well enough, but cracks were forming. By the late 1960s, confidence began to erode. Some countries started converting dollars into gold. American gold reserves declined. The promise made at Bretton Woods became harder to keep, and the system that had rebuilt the world now faced a reckoning of its own. This moment matters because it reveals something fundamental about global finance. Bretton Woods didn't just create rules. It created habits. It trained governments, banks, and corporations to operate inside a dollar-centered universe. Even when the system began to strain, no one could imagine a world without it. And that's the paradox of power. The more successful a system becomes, the harder it is to change, even when its foundations begin to crack. In the next part of this story, we'll reach the breaking point. We'll see what happens when promises made in 1944 collide with economic reality, why the gold link finally snapped, and how the end of Bretton Woods didn't weaken the dollar, but transformed it into something even more powerful. Because when the old rules collapsed, the dollar didn't fall with them. It adapted, and the consequences of that adaptation still shape the global economy today. By the end of the 1960s, the system created at Bretton Woods was still standing, but it was no longer stable. What had once been a carefully balanced framework had turned into a quiet act of faith. Governments trusted that the dollar was still as good as gold. Markets trusted that the United States would honor its promise. And the United States trusted that no one would push the system too far. That trust was about to be tested. The contradiction at the heart of Bretton Woods had grown too large to ignore. To supply the world with dollars, the United States had spent more than it earned 4 years. Those dollars accumulated overseas, sitting in foreign central banks, far from Fort Knox. On paper, every one of them was redeemable for gold at $35 an ounce. In reality, there was nowhere near enough gold to back them all. This wasn't a secret. It was an open fact that everyone chose to live with. At first, the imbalance seemed manageable. Economic growth was strong. Trade was expanding. Confidence remained high. But as U.S. spending accelerated, driven by the Vietnam War, social programs, and a growing global military presence, the flow of dollars leaving the country became a flood. By the late 1960s, foreign-held dollars exceeded America's gold reserves by a wide margin. This is where the system stopped being economic and became psychological. France was among the first to openly challenge the arrangement. President Charles de Gaulle questioned why the United States enjoyed what he called an exorbitant privilege. Why should one country be able to pay for real goods with paper that others were forced to treat as reserves? France began converting its dollar holdings into gold, publicly and deliberately. Ships crossed the Atlantic, carrying American gold to European vaults. Other countries noticed. What followed wasn't a run on the bank. Not yet, but something more dangerous. Doubt. Central banks started asking whether they should convert their dollars while they still could. The math was inevitable. If too many countries demanded gold at the same time, the system would collapse. The United States faced a choice it had been postponing for years. Maintain the gold promise and drain its reserves, or break the promise and rewrite the rules of global finance. By 1971, the situation was no longer sustainable. Inflation was rising at home. Trade deficits were widening. Gold reserves were shrinking. And confidence, the invisible pillar of Bretton Woods, was eroding. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on television. The speech was calm, measured, almost reassuring. There was no dramatic announcement of the end of an era, no warning of global consequences. Instead, Nixon framed his decision as temporary, technical, and necessary to protect the American economy. The United States, he said, would suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. That suspension was never lifted. In one evening, the central promise of Bretton Woods was broken. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. The fixed exchange rate system unraveled, and the world entered a new monetary era, whether it was ready or not. This moment is often described as a collapse. In reality, it was a transformation. For other countries, the end of gold convertibility was exchange rates began to float. Currencies fluctuated. Inflation surged across the globe. The 1970s became a decade of economic turbulence, oil shocks, and uncertainty. The predictable framework that had governed international trade for a quarter century was gone. But for the United States, something unexpected happened. The dollar didn't lose its dominance. Despite the broken promise, despite inflation, despite global frustration, the dollar remained at the center of the system. Trade was still conducted in dollars. Reserves were still held in dollars. Financial markets still revolved around dollar liquidity. The world had been trained to operate inside a dollar-based architecture, and there was no alternative large enough to replace it. This is the critical pivot point. Before 1971, the dollar was powerful because it was backed by gold. After 1971, it was powerful because everything depended on it. What had once been a promise of convertibility became a reality of necessity. Floating exchange rates gave the United States something it had never fully possessed before: monetary freedom. It could expand the money supply without worrying about gold reserves. It could respond to crises with liquidity. It could finance deficits in its own currency. Other countries had to adjust. The issuer of the reserve currency set the terms. This shift reshaped global finance in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Banks adapted quickly. Financial markets expanded. New instruments emerged to manage currency risk. The euro-dollar market grew explosively, allowing dollars to circulate outside the direct control of the U.S. government. Capital flows accelerated. Money became more abstract, more mobile, and more powerful. At the same time, something subtle changed in how governments thought about money itself. Under Bretton Woods, discipline had been external. Gold imposed limits. After 1971, discipline became political. Inflation was no longer constrained by reserves, but by credibility. Central banks had to convince markets they would act responsibly. Trust replaced metal. The United States, however, enjoyed a unique advantage. Because global demand for dollars remained strong, it could absorb inflationary pressures more easily than others. When crises hit elsewhere, capital often fled into dollar assets, reinforcing the very dominance critics complained about. This wasn't planned in 1944. It emerged from momentum. By breaking the gold link, the United States didn't abandon leadership. It redefined it. The dollar became the default settlement layer of the global economy. Oil was priced in dollars. Debt was issued in dollars. International finance moved through dollar-based systems. Even countries that distrusted American policy had to operate within the framework it shaped. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because the end of Bretton Woods didn't eliminate imbalance, it amplified it. The same asymmetry that existed before one country issuing the world's reserve currency now operated without formal constraints. The benefits were enormous. So were the risks. This new system required constant confidence, not in gold, but in institutions, markets, and the long-term stability of American governance. As long as that confidence held, the system functioned. When it wavered, the consequences were immediate and global. This is why 1971 matters more than most people realize. It wasn't just the end of a monetary system. It was the beginning of a world where money itself became more flexible, more political, and more central to power than ever before. A world where crises would be met not with metal, but with liquidity, where influence flowed through financial plumbing rather than formal agreements. And once the world crossed that line, there was no going back. In the next part, we'll see how this new dollar system was reinforced, not weakened, through energy markets, debt, and crisis management. How oil, interest rates, and global institutions locked in the post-1971 order, and why every major financial shock since then has followed the same underlying pattern. Because the promise ended in 1971, but the system that replaced it became even harder to escape. When the gold link was severed in 1971, the world didn't immediately understand what had replaced it. What was clear was what no longer existed. A fixed anchor, a physical guarantee, a promise that could be measured and verified. What followed was not chaos, but improvisation. And inside that improvisation, a new architecture quietly took shape. The dollar no longer needed gold. It needed demand. And demand, as it turned out, could be engineered. The first stress test of the post-Bretton Woods world arrived faster than anyone expected. In October 1973, a geopolitical conflict thousands of miles from Washington triggered a shock that reshaped the global economy. The Yom Kippur War led Arab oil producers to impose an embargo on nations supporting Israel. Oil prices quadrupled in a matter of months. For industrial economies, this wasn't just an energy crisis. It was a monetary one. Oil was the lifeblood of modern economies. Transportation, manufacturing, electricity, everything depended on it. Suddenly, countries needed far more dollars to purchase the same amount of energy. Inflation surged. Trade balances collapsed. Entire economies slowed or stalled. But inside this disruption, the United States found leverage. Instead of weakening the dollar, the oil shock increased global demand for it. Oil-exporting nations priced crude exclusively in dollars. Importing countries had no choice but to acquire dollars to keep their economies running. The dollar, untethered from gold, became tethered to energy. This was not an accident. In the mid-1970s, the United States reached a strategic understanding with Saudi Arabia, the most influential oil producer in the world. The agreement was straightforward but profound. Saudi oil would be sold exclusively in US dollars. In return, the United States would provide military protection, security guarantees, and access to financial markets. This arrangement soon expanded across OPEC. The petrodollar system was born. Under this system, oil revenues accumulated in dollar-denominated assets. Those dollars didn't sit idle. They were recycled through American and European banks, funding loans, investments, and government debt. Oil exporters deposited their earnings into the same financial system that underpinned U.S. dominance. The result was a self-reinforcing loop. Energy demand created dollar demand. Dollar demand strengthened U.S. financial markets. Strong markets attracted global capital, and global capital flowed back into U.S. government bonds, keeping borrowing costs low and liquidity high. What gold had once done through scarcity, oil now did through necessity. At the same time, the architecture of global debt expanded rapidly. Developing countries, hit hard by higher energy costs, borrowed heavily to finance imports and stabilize their economies. Much of that debt was denominated in dollars. As long as growth continued and interest rates remained manageable, the system appeared stable. But it was fragile. When the United States raised interest rates sharply in the early 1980s to combat inflation, the consequences were immediate and severe. Dollar-denominated debt became more expensive to service. Capital flowed back into U.S. assets. Currencies in Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia collapsed. This wasn't just a financial adjustment. It was a systemic crisis. Countries found themselves unable to pay. Entire regions entered what became known as the lost decade. Growth stagnated. Poverty increased. Political instability followed. And once again, the institutions created at Bretton Woods moved to the center of the response. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank re-emerged as enforcers of stability and discipline. Emergency loans came with conditions: fiscal austerity, privatization, currency reforms. Governments had to restructure their economies to regain access to dollar liquidity. This is where the post-1971 system revealed its true nature. Power no longer flowed through formal agreements or gold convertibility. It flowed through access. Access to dollars, access to markets, access to institutions that could open or close the financial bloodstream of a nation. The United States didn't need to dictate outcomes directly. The structure did it automatically. If a country aligned with the system, capital flowed. If it resisted, financing dried up. Exchange rates collapsed. Inflation surged. The cost of independence became measurable in interest rates and capital flight. Meanwhile, Wall Street grew into the nerve center of global finance. Financial innovation accelerated. Derivatives, futures, and complex instruments allowed risk to be traded, hedged, and amplified. Capital moved faster than ever before, unconstrained by borders, but deeply anchored to the dollar system. Crises became features, not failures. The Latin American debt crisis, the Asian financial crisis, the Russian default. Each followed a similar pattern. Rapid capital inflows, sudden reversals, currency collapse, IMF intervention. And after each crisis, the role of the dollar emerged stronger, not weaker. This wasn't because the system was fair. It was because it was unavoidable. Even countries that criticized American financial dominance held their reserves in dollars. Even rivals conducted trade in dollar-denominated markets. Alternatives existed in theory, but none matched the liquidity, scale, and institutional depth of the U.S. system. By the 1990s, the transformation that began in 1971 was complete. The dollar had become more than a currency. It was infrastructure. Global trade cleared through it. Financial contracts referenced it. Central banks managed their policies around it. The world's savings flowed into it during times of uncertainty. And this infrastructure could be used strategically. Sanctions, once symbolic, became devastating. Cutting access to dollar settlement systems could paralyze economies. Freezing assets held in U.S.-linked institutions became a powerful geopolitical tool. Financial dominance translated directly into political leverage. This is the paradox of the post-Bretton Woods order. The system is decentralized, market-driven, and flexible, but its core is highly concentrated. Trust is distributed, but control is not. And every time a crisis tests the structure, the same question emerges. Is there an alternative? So far, the answer has always been no. But that answer depends on confidence, the same invisible force that replaced gold in 1971. Confidence in institutions, in governance, in the long-term stability of the system's anchor. And confidence, unlike gold, can erode quietly. In the final part, we'll examine the modern era. The rise of financial warfare, digital money, competing reserve ambitions, and the growing tension between dependence and resistance. We'll ask whether the system built after Bretton Woods, reinforced by oil, debt, and crisis, can survive the pressures now forming against it. Because the dollar's greatest strength is also its greatest vulnerability. And the next shock may not come from a war or an embargo or a rate hike, but from the question the world has avoided for over 50 years. What happens if confidence breaks? For more than half a century, the global financial system has operated on a quiet assumption, not written into any treaty, not backed by gold, not enforced by law, an assumption so deeply embedded that most people never question it, that the dollar will always be there. Every crisis we've examined so far, Bretton Woods, the end of gold, oil shocks, debt, crises, financial globalization, did not weaken the system. They strengthened it. Each shock forced adaptation. Each adaptation expanded the reach of the dollar. By the early 21st century, American financial power had reached a level no empire had ever achieved. And then something changed. Not soothingly, not dramatically, but subtly, and in ways that only become obvious in hindsight. The first shift was the transformation of money itself. Physical currency gave way to digital flows. Banking became software. Transactions became data. The financial system moved faster than regulation, faster than politics, faster than public understanding. This made the system more efficient and more fragile. At the same time, the dollar's role expanded beyond commerce into enforcement. Sanctions were no longer symbolic gestures. They became precise instruments. Countries could be excluded from payment systems. Assets could be frozen with keystrokes. Access to global finance could be revoked without a single soldier crossing a border. For policymakers in Washington, this was power without precedent. For the rest of the world, it was a warning. When financial infrastructure becomes a weapon, dependence becomes risk. This realization didn't come from ideology. It came from experience. Nations watched what happened to others, how quickly reserves could be immobilized, how trade could be disrupted, how economic pressure could reshape political choices. And slowly, quietly, conversations began behind closed doors. What if the system we depend on can be turned against us? China accelerated efforts to internationalize its currency. Russia increased gold reserves and reduced dollar exposure. Regional payment systems were developed. Bilateral trade agreements bypassed traditional clearing mechanisms. None of these moves replaced the dollar. But they revealed intent, not to overthrow the system, but to hedge against it. At the same time, debt levels in advanced economies surged to historic highs. Government borrowing expanded not in response to war or depression, but as a structural feature of governance. Central banks intervened more aggressively, blurring the line between fiscal and monetary policy. Money creation, once exceptional, became routine. This raised a question that had been dormant since 1971. If the dollar is backed only by confidence, what happens when confidence is tested from within? Inflation spikes. Asset bubbles inflate and deflate. Inequality widens. Trust in institutions weakens. None of these developments collapse a system overnight, but they chip away at the psychological foundation that holds it together. And yet, despite everything, the dollar remains dominant. When crises hit, capital still runs toward U.S. assets. Treasury bonds are still treated as the ultimate safe haven. The dollar still clears the majority of global trade. Even rivals hold it in reserve. This is the paradox at the heart of modern finance. The more people question the system, the more they rely on it. The more alternatives are discussed, the more distant they appear. The dollar persists, not because it is perfect, but because it is embedded. Replacing it would require not just a new currency, but a new legal system, new markets, new institutions, and above all, new trust. Trust built over decades, tested by crises, reinforced by habit. No challenger has yet proven capable of that. But history teaches us something important. Every system that appears permanent eventually encounters a limit it cannot adapt around. The gold standard failed not because gold disappeared, but because the world outgrew it. Bretton Woods collapsed, not because it was flawed, but because American power outpaced its own constraints. The current system is no different. Its strength lies in flexibility. Its weakness lies in concentration. The dollar carries the weight of global expectations, global savings, global stability, and that weight continues to grow. The question is not whether the system will change. The question is how and under what conditions. Will it be gradual, negotiated, and managed, or sudden, chaotic, and forced by crises? Will technology decentralize money in ways states cannot control? Will geopolitical fragmentation fracture financial infrastructure? Or will the dollar once again absorb the shock and emerge stronger? No one knows. What we do know is this: the world we live in, the prices we pay, the markets we watch. The crises we fear is the product of decisions made decades ago in conference rooms, during wars, and in moments of uncertainty. The dominance of the dollar was not inevitable. It was constructed, maintained, reinforced, and like all constructed systems, it depends on belief. Belief that obligations will be honored, that rules will be enforced, that power will be exercised responsibly, that stability is preferable to disruption. If that belief holds, the system endures. If it fractures, the consequences will not be confined to markets or currencies. They will shape politics, alliances, and daily life in ways most people are unprepared for. That is why this story matters. Not as history, but as context, because the next chapter is not written yet. And whether the dollar remains the backbone of global finance or becomes a symbol of a passing era depends on choices being made right now, quietly, behind closed doors. If you had to bet on the future, Would you trust the system as it is? Or do you think the world is already preparing for something that comes after? Let me know in the comments.